The rain poured down in thick sheets, drenching the streets of New York City. It was one of those nights where people hurried past each other, heads down, shoulders hunched, too busy with their own lives to notice much of anything. But for Alexander, Wright, the billionaire CEO of Wright Industries, the world always seemed to make way for him. His tailored suit remained untouched by the rain, thanks to the massive umbrella held by his personal assistant, and the sleek black car waiting for him at the curb was warm and inviting. Alexander was a man who had everything: money, power, influence. Yet, despite his wealth, there was a sharp edge to him, an unshakable coldness in his eyes. Success had hardened him. He believed in numbers, logic, and hard work. To him, luck was an excuse for the weak, and kindness was a luxury he could not afford. As he strode toward his car, a voice cut through the noise of the city. "Sir, could you spare a moment?" Alexander almost didn't stop. Almost. But something about the voice, deep, steady, and oddly familiar, made him glance sideways. There, huddled beneath a flickering street lamp, was an older black man, his clothes tattered, his hands weathered by time and hardship. His eyes, though, held something rare: wisdom. Alexander exhaled impatiently. "I don't carry cash," the old man chuckled, shaking his head. "I ain't asking for money, son. Just a moment of your time." Alexander hesitated. He had meetings, deals to close, an empire to run. But there was something about this man's presence that unsettled him. Against his better judgment, he stepped forward. "Make it quick." The old man studied him, nodding slightly as if confirming something to himself. "You walk like a man who's got the world at his feet, but a storm in his heart." Alexander scoffed. "I'm fine." "Maybe," the old man mused, "but maybe not. A man who's truly at peace wouldn't be out here in the rain, staring at a stranger like he's seen a ghost." Alexander stiffened. The way the man spoke, it was as if he knew something, as if he had reached into a part of Alexander's soul that even he didn't fully understand. "Listen, I don't have time for riddles," Alexander said. The old man nodded again, as if he expected that response. "Fair enough. Then let me give you a piece of advice, free of charge. Sometimes the past ain't what you think it is. Sometimes the truth has been right in front of you your whole life. You just didn't know where to look." Something in Alexander's chest tightened, an unfamiliar weight pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but the old man turned, disappearing into the night like he had never been there at all. For the first time in years, Alexander felt unsettled. He climbed into his car, his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to answer. Who was that man? And why did it feel like he had just been given a warning he couldn't afford to ignore? As the city lights blurred past his window, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that his life, his perfectly controlled, meticulously built life, was about to change forever. Alexander Wright sat in the back of his car, his fingers tapping restlessly against the leather seat. He had spent his entire life dismissing nonsense, superstitions, emotions, anything that couldn't be measured in numbers. And yet, the words of that old man clung to him like a shadow. Sometimes the past ain't what you think it is. The thought gnawed at him. He had built his entire empire on certainty, on knowing exactly where he came from and where he was going. He was Alexander Wright, son of Richard Wright, heir to a legacy of power and success. There was no mystery. In his past, his father had made sure of that. But something about the old man's presence, his voice, the way he spoke as if he knew him, it unsettled Alexander in a way he couldn't explain. When he arrived home, his penthouse was as pristine As ever, the floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the New York skyline. Yet, for the first time, it felt hollow. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but the burn did nothing to clear his mind. He pulled out his phone and searched for something, anything, that might explain why a stranger on the street had shaken him so deeply. Nothing. No familiar faces. No forgotten connections. And yet, he couldn't let it go. The next morning, instead of heading straight to his office, Alexander found himself taking a different route, back to the very spot where he had met the old man. The streets were crowded, the usual rush of people moving like a current, but the man was nowhere to be seen. He asked a nearby coffee vendor if he had seen an older black man, wearing a worn-out coat, possibly homeless. The vendor raised an eyebrow. "You talking about Elijah?" The name sent a jolt through Alexander, though he didn't know why. "Elijah," he repeated. "Who is he?" The vendor shrugged. "Been around for years. Doesn't beg, doesn't bother nobody. Just sits and watches. Some say he used to be somebody important, but you know how it is. People fall through the cracks. Ain't much of his story left." That wasn't enough for Alexander. His gut told him there was more. Something deeper. He spent the next several days searching for Elijah, but the man seemed to have disappeared. At the same time, something else started to gnaw at him. The memories of his father. Richard Wright had been a formidable man, known for his ruthless business sense and his belief that weakness was unacceptable. Alexander had spent his entire life living up to those expectations. But now, for the first time, he started to wonder, had his father kept things from him? Alexander returned to his family's estate, a mansion that had been in the Wright family for generations. His mother had passed years ago, and his father had died shortly after, leaving him as the sole heir. The house had always felt more like a monument than a home. But now, as he walked through its halls, it felt different, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. In his father's old study, he ran his hands along the shelves, scanning the books, the files. His father had kept meticulous records, but Alexander had never bothered to dig into them before. Now, something told him he needed to. Hours passed before he found it. A locked drawer in his father's desk. He pried it open, heart pounding. Inside was a single file, yellowed with age, and inside that file was a birth certificate, Alexander's. Breath caught. It wasn't his. It belonged to someone else. Someone with the last name, Wright. And the father's name, Richard Wright. His hand shook as he flipped through the documents, newspaper clippings, letters, pieces of a life that had been hidden away, a life that had been erased, a son who had been born before Alexander, a son whose name had been buried. Elijah's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes, the truth has been right in front of you your whole life. You just didn't know where to look. His father had another child, another heir, and for some reason, he had made sure the world never knew. Alexander's chest tightened as realization hit him like a tidal wave. Elijah hadn't been a stranger at all. He had been family. Alexander sat frozen, the old papers trembling in his hands. His father had a son before him, a brother he never knew existed, and somehow, that brother had ended up living on the streets, erased from the world his father built. His mind raced with questions. Why had his father hidden this? Why had Elijah, his own flesh and blood, been cast aside? He felt a surge of anger, confusion, and something else, guilt. He had spent his life believing in the right legacy, priding himself on carrying forward his father's empire. But now, that empire felt built on lies. Without thinking, he grabbed the file and rushed out. He had to find Elijah. The streets were as busy as ever, but Alexander barely noticed the crowd as he moved through them. He returned to the spot where he had first seen Elijah, his heart pounding. But again, nothing. Days passed, and still there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished. Frustration built inside Alexander. He couldn't let it end like this. He hired private investigators, sent people looking all over the city. He needed answers. Then, one evening, his driver received a tip. A shelter downtown had seen a man matching Elijah's description. Alexander didn't wait. He went himself. When he arrived, he spotted him immediately. Elijah was sitting on an old bench, staring out at the city. Looking as calm as ever, Alexander took a deep breath and walked up to him. Elijah! The older man turned, his eyes settling on Alexander with quiet recognition. There was no surprise, no shock, just a knowing look, like he had been expecting this moment all along. "So, you finally found what you were looking for," Elijah said, his voice steady. Alexander sat beside him, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "You're my brother." Elijah nodded slowly. "Yeah." A silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Alexander struggled to process it all. "Why didn't you tell me that night?" Elijah gave a small chuckle. "Would you have believed me?" Alexander exhaled sharply. He knew the answer. If Elijah had told him that night, he would have dismissed it, walked away, never given it another thought. "My father." Alexander's voice wavered. Why did he do this? Elijah's expression darkened slightly, but there was no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance. Richard Wright wasn't a man who liked loose ends. My mother wasn't someone he could build his empire with. So he made a choice. He erased me, paid to keep it quiet, gave her enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. The words hit Alexander like a punch. He had always seen his father as a ruthless businessman. But this was something else. A secret child abandoned, left to struggle, while Alexander had been given everything. "I had no idea," Alexander admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah smiled faintly. "I know." The weight of it all pressed down on Alexander. He had spent his life believing in his father's legacy, chasing power, building wealth. But none of it mattered now. Not when the man he admired had destroyed lives just to protect his image. For the first time, Alexander saw his empire for what it really was. Not just a symbol of success, but a monument built on broken pieces. "I want to make things right," he said suddenly. "Whatever I can do." Elijah held up a hand. "This ain't about money, Alexander. Never was." He looked him in the eye. "What matters is what you do next. Not for me, not for guilt, but for yourself." Alexander nodded slowly. He understood. This wasn't just about fixing the past. It was about deciding the kind of man he wanted to be moving forward. He didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but for the first time, he was ready to figure it out as he sat there beside his brother, the city buzzing around them. Alexander Wright, billionaire, businessman, and son of a man he no longer admired, made a choice. He would not be his father's shadow. He would be better.